Perhaps the best part about satire is the fact that it can so easily go over the heads of the very same people it wishes to critique. This is certainly the case when it comes to 1982's Slumber Party Massacre, a feminist slasher classic. What makes the film so revolutionary is the sheer fact that it came out during the height of the slasher genre, utilized much of the same tropes, and received relative critical acclaim. The ability for these two women to take the absolute piss out of a genre so seemingly anti-feminist was revolutionary and continues to leave its mark on the genre today. To understand why, we have to start at the beginning. Moral panics have existed almost as long as societies have. In the 1980s, this is best understood through the lens of conservatism. In the 1960s and 1970s, America and many other developed nations underwent what is known as sexual liberation or the sexual revolution. This is a movement that is defined by the challenging of traditional norms and codes of behavior related to sexuality and interpersonal relationships. Conservatism, therefore, can be understood as a reaction to this, with Ronald Reagan as the figurehead leading the movement. Reagan led these national crusades in the name of moral panic throughout the 1980s. Conservatives focus on an idea of individualism, where freedom comes from responsible choice and moral principles, and social ills are deemed behavioral problems, and Reagan applied this to a plethora of issues like AIDS, teen pregnancy, abortion, and drug addiction. Bad situations are therefore the result of one's own personal choices and a lack of individual self-will and restraint. Sexual moral panics come from the fear of sexuality. Sexuality is defined by a wide range of static and changing sexual desires, identities, and behaviors, with normal behaviors being defined as heterosexual, monogamous, and for procreation only. Of course, these norms are defined by dominant members of society, which are often white, wealthy men. And they use these ideals to regulate and prohibit certain types of sexual expression and leverage and shape public opinion against the individuals who deviate from these societal norms. Female sexuality is especially controlled and regulated because the sexual activity begets negative societal reaction. This comes in the form of two schemas, the good girl versus the bad girl. Women whose behavior are within the boundaries of traditional or stereotypical gender norms like wife, mother, or virgin are considered good, while those who challenge these roles by being sexually assertive, promiscuous, or whores are considered bad. Sexual moral panics are a means of sanctioning these individuals and their sexuality, which deviates from normal societal norms, by defining their behaviors as appropriate versus inappropriate. Sometimes these ideals permeate into popular culture, namely film, and in the 1980s this was seen through slashers. Carol Clover comments on this in her feminist essay, Her Body Himself, where she defines a slasher as an immensely generative story of a psycho killer who slashes to death a string of mostly female victims one by one until he himself is subdued or killed, usually by the one girl who survives. She further argues that slashers give us a clearer picture of sexual attitudes held by mainstream audience, more so than any other genre or media. This is because horror serves as an engagement of repressed fears and desires, reenacting the conflict surrounding these feelings. This is done in a voyeuristic and encroaching on pornographic manner, where the violence of the horror is reduced to an enactment of archaic sexual feelings. The killer is a sexually disturbed male, and the victim is a beautiful, sexually active female. She further comments on this in describing the elements of a slasher, namely the killer, the victims, and the final girl. The killer and his violence is an alternative or substitute to actual sex, and victims are seen as having sex and then getting killed almost immediately after, setting up this gruesome cause and effect relationship we see throughout many slashers in the genre. In contrast to this, the final girl is categorically not like other girls. She is not sexually active, she's either uninterested or unavailable, and she has a level-headedness and courage to her. Her smartness, her gravity, and her competence are distinctly boyish and therefore unfeminine, distinguishing her from the other girls. By placing female characters in two camps, the good girls and the bad girls, it reflects larger societal ideals about female sexuality and moral panic surrounding them. Good girls are rewarded with survival for conforming to gender norms and appropriate female behavior, while the victimization of bad girls is not met with the same sympathy or compassion as good girls, because their brutalization is being seen as instigated by their own sexuality and not conforming to norms. This is so pervasive within the slasher genre that studies have been done to prove this relationship exists. One such study, done in 2010 by Andrew Welsh, explored this very relationship, based on 50 slasher films and over 490 victims. He found that there was a significant association between a character's involvement in sexual activity and the outcome of physical aggression only for female characters. Female characters who did not engage in sexual activity were more likely to survive than those who did. Furthermore, Welsh's study found that death scenes for women were not only longer than their male counterparts, but sexual characters' deaths were even longer and more drawn out than non-sexual characters. What's most important about this is that there was no significant difference between sexual and non-sexual male characters. It only existed for female characters. So this serves to prove that there is something especially depraved about female sexuality, and this phenomenon becomes very clear when we look at slasher subgenre. This brings us to 1982's Slumber Party Massacre. This film was written by feminist author Rita Mae Brown and directed by Amy Holden Jones. A little bit more about Rita Mae Brown is that she's well renowned for being a feminist and queer author, most notably for fighting tirelessly throughout her career for the inclusion of queer women. She finds her roots in the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, which is directly related to the context of 1980s conservatism. The film was definitely ahead of its time. It was originally meant to be a parody of slashers, but producers pushed back on this, wanting a more marketable and profitable slasher film. However, its intended purpose was not entirely lost, and as the film exists today, it is very much a feminist critique and satirical take on the tropes of the slasher genre. In terms of the sexualization of women and the critique on it, this comes in the form of nudity within the film. Although it must be noted that this nudity is not punishing, there is no sense of sex equals death, and it more so comments on the male gaze and the sexualization of the female body. The sheer amount of nudity within the film is almost comical. Within the first 2 minutes, there is full frontal nudity showing boobs, and it includes an over 2 minute long shower scene with close-ups, camera panning up and down the women's bodies. I think this is because the female characters are more than just their bodies, which deviates from typical slasher genre. These characters are actual people. They have context, they're complex, they are nuanced, and most importantly, they're smart. They exhibit what Clover dubs the active investigating gaze, which is usually reserved for male characters and is often punished in women. This is not the case throughout the movie, though. The women are weary to go places alone, they peer out windows, and they close the curtains. Well, mostly. Which brings me to my next point, which is the role of men and the critique on the predatory male gaze. This is most often exhibited through the use of camera lens, which is something Clover also brings up in her essay, and is most easily summed up as E. Ann Kaplan says. Within the film text itself, men gaze at women who become objects of the gaze. The spectator, in turn, is made to identify with this male gaze and to objectify the woman on screen. This is definitely seen throughout the movie, and I would say it's very heavily portrayed. Most clearly, the male characters are creeps and weirdos. You never really know if the camera view that you're seeing is from the point of view of the killer or from the boys, and I think that is such a creative decision. First, to get into the killer, who's obviously the most creepy, because he is doing the murder and propelling the plot, but very little is known about him other than he is a killer on the loose. He's literally goofy. He's prancing around, he has beady eyes, he has these little smirks, he's wearing jean on jean, and he barely speaks, instead making these weird little grunting noises, which I found very comical. But when he does speak, his motives become clear, and he is sexually motivated like most other killers in the slasher subgenre. Like other killers in the slasher subgenre. In one of the final scenes, when he finally speaks and talks to main characters Trish and Valerie, he says things like, "You are pretty, you're all very pretty, I love you," and most damning, he says, "You know you want it, you love it." Because again, female characters are sexualized by men and then therefore deserve whatever punishment comes to them because they are sexualized. Another character of interest that is really creepy is the older guy slash family friend. It's never really made clear who this guy is or what his purpose is, but he definitely gives me creepy pedophile groomer vibes. He's always sneaking up on Trish. He's saying things like, oh, I won't tell about the weed or the drinking if you don't tell your parents I scared you, which leads me to believe that he's not supposed to be there or that her parents don't know he's there while they're out of town. This is really the most creepy part for me is when in his death scene where he is seen lurking in the backyard after telling Trish that he had went home moments prior. Why was he still there? Very creepy. What was he doing? Was he peering through the windows? Who knows? And finally, the male friends who exist in the plot because they are trying to scheme their way into this sleepover that they were not invited to. They're peeping Toms, they are peering through the window while the girls are changing, which is something that is not inherently sexualized, but through the male gaze, it becomes sexualized. And they're giggling, they're staring, they're making weird comments like, there she goes, or I don't think I've been giving Kim the attention she deserves, which is super rapey. And they just serve as antagonists in the same way that the killer does. For instance, in one scene, they hide in the garage, they cut the fuses and the lights, and lure the girls out there just to scare them. That is the sole purpose of that. So, judging from this movie, the conclusion we can make is that men are predators, sexualize women, and women have to deal with this on and off the screen on a daily basis. Because of what is known about the fear of female sexuality and how this is played out in the slasher film genre in the 1980s, it's safe to say that A Slumber Party Massacre is not only a feminist film, but was arguably way ahead of its time. It explored the ways in which a female-directed and written film can grapple with tropes and ideals within the same genre it is wishing to critique. In essence, it gave space for women not only on the screen, but off the screen as well. It allowed women to see portrayals of them in a positive manner, in a nuanced, complex way, and allowed female audience viewers to identify with these characters. It also gave women a way to become more involved behind the scenes in making these films, and we see this legacy held today. I think what we should take away from this is that sex is not punishing, female sexuality is nothing to become morally panicked about, and at the end of the day, men are just creeps and weirdos.